So it's with great privilege and honour that we welcome David here this afternoon. David came and spoke with us a couple of years ago, probably maybe 4 years ago, I think it was.
Yeah, lost track.
So it's always wonderful when he is in the area that we actually sit down together and have a conversation. So, just to kick us off, definitions are a funny thing and they do change over time, and what we read in a book can differ vastly to what is spoken. So David, to kick us off, what is permaculture and how has your definition changed over time?
Well, I often describe permaculture as being primarily a design system for regenerative living and land use. So concerned with both the production side of how we get our needs from a working relationship with nature and how we organise ourselves in our households, communities to interact and allocate all of those things. So if you like, it's the people and the land, but coming from a design system perspective. I suppose that's evolved from a core idea 50 years ago of a question that Bill Mollison framed when he asked me what I was going to do in my freewheeling studies in environmental design, which was probably the most radical experiment in tertiary education in Australia's history, of which I was a first year student coming to the end of that and looking at what I wanted to focus on. And I said, well, I think I'm interested in landscape architecture more than architecture or urban planning. I'm interested in the science of ecology, especially as systems ecology, and how that all applies to agriculture. And I could see how two of those came together, but I couldn't see anywhere where three came together. So for me, that was the moving in from the macro to sort of focusing in. And I suppose what Bill said to me, he says, okay, how about this for an idea then? If most places on the planet with anywhere reasonable rainfall, nature creates some sort of forest as a default ecosystem, why doesn't our agriculture, if not look like a forest, function like a forest? And I said, perfect. That is a design problem, relates to landscape. It uses ecological theory and addresses the core problem of civilization, which is agriculture. It's what's destroyed all past civilizations. Perhaps apart from, of course, the East Asian civilization, which one of those books that we referenced at the time, Permanent Agriculture, was the subtitle of that book, Farmers of 40 Centuries, by American agronomist scientists going to China, Japan and Korea to see why is this the only civilization that didn't destroy its soil base. So permaculture in a sense can be seen as just like a branch off the tree of organic agriculture in its origins, but it has sort of evolved to become a bit of a theory of everything. But maybe could simplify that. Just been visiting one of the cranky pioneers of permaculture experimentation in the southern mountains of New South Wales at Tumbarumba, and Neil Druce, who I haven't connected with for a long time. And he said, permaculture is applied human ecology. And that's pretty simple. And that covers a very wide field.
It does, which kind of swings us into the next question. So you were in your 20s when you co-wrote Permaculture 1 with Bill Mollison. Since that time, have you ever wanted to change any of the 12 principles or perhaps even add another one?
Well, the first thing to say is Permaculture 1, which we've just republished as a downloadable PDF facsimile of the book, which has been out of print since 1990, doesn't have a clear list of principles. The principles are implicit in the text. In Permaculture 2, which Mollison followed up with a year later in 1979, there isn't either. And then you get to his great work a decade later, the Designer's Manual. There are many different principles and laws of necessitous use and other framings of things that underpin permaculture, but there's not a clear list of design principles. It's only after teaching permaculture through permaculture design courses for a decade, of which I was an observer from a distance, that Mollison with Rennie Slay in the introduction to permaculture, published in 1990, is there a clear list of principles. So my relationship to that was to observe that teaching and be somewhat critical but amazed at what was being created in the way of a movement. And then I was invited to teach on a permaculture design course in 91 by two young teachers on the south coast of New South Wales, Hugh Graverstein, who was already a second generation permaculture teacher. His father, Fries Graverstein, was of Bill Mollison's generation. And they said, well, you're the co-originator, how about you teach principles? And I went, oh, shit. And I had enough respect in my critique of the way I had observed principles being taught to start with that, what has since been called the Mollison framework. And then through the 90s, I naturally sort of tweaked that, and of course there was all sorts of other influences and other authors, and then that led to the publication of Permaculture Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, and that had a big influence through the global permaculture networks, because it seemed to take the permaculture principles out of just applicable to gardening, agriculture, land management, to be some larger sort of universal principles. The question of since that time, because that's now 25 years ago, people have said things like, isn't resilience a fundamental principle of permaculture? And going back through the text, I realised that I had referenced how different principles contribute to resilience, but not stated up front that effectively all the 12 principles all contribute to resilience. So resilience is really a system characteristic that we're not creating by just as one of 12 principles. It sort of emerges out of all of them. So a lot of people have found that framework continuing to be useful, and a lot of feedback on it, but you can go online and research permaculture principles and get lists from 3 to maybe 150 principles. I think anything beyond 12 is a bit hard to remember, which is even with 12, which is why Richard Telford's icons that encapsulate that. But the understanding and deepening, using the principles as a thinking tool to delve deeper, can uncover more things.
So if you had to pick one or two, could you?
Pick one or two to...
Principles.
Oh.
Like, I guess, is one or two more important than the others, or if we have limited space? Time?
I see them all as spokes of a wheel that work in tension to keep the wheel round and true and rolling. So they're actually opposite each other. Like the power principles of catch and store energy and obtain a yield are about productivity, how systems grow, dare I say even capitalism brought down to a size that makes sense, and they're balanced by the principles of, firstly, accepting feedback, negative feedback, and also the principles of diversity and edge and integration all act as a balance. So they're balancing one another.
Like a spider's web, it's a system. So let's go a little bit back to the 1970s. What a great era, hey? Are you able to share with us some of the books you were reading at the time, or the thought leaders that inspired you and Bill?
Well, in 1974 I met Bill, and the same year I read Small is Beautiful by E.F. Schumacher, the economist, published the year before, published the same year as the first oil crisis, triggered a lot of awareness about the dependence of society on fossil fuel. That was one incredible book that was influential. It's interesting also, the Russian naturalist and political anarchist Kropotkin, his book Mutual Aid, and some of his other books were incredibly influential. I think he's sort of like a proto-ecologist in many ways. There were the writings of Edward Goldsmith, who was the editor of The Ecologist magazine, which was not actually a scientific magazine, it was sort of more of an activist and philosophy, but especially his essay about the ecological interpretation of the decline of the Roman Empire was immensely influential and deepened my interest in what's called ecological history, the explanations based on nature, geography, those sorts of things of why history is like it is, rather than the great man theory of history or the ideology theory of history. I mentioned F.H. King, Farmers of 40 Centuries. Perhaps the pivotal book was Tree Crops, A Permanent Agriculture, because it zoomed in that huge, relatively untapped potential of trees as sources of food and sustenance, rather than being completely dependent on annual crops. And of course P.A. Yeoman's as Keyline Farming, sort of rational land-based design for catching and storing water and nutrients in the landscape in soil and biomass, which is sort of predates all of the work about rehydration or regenerative systems or carbon capture and storage, all of these ideas. So many things that were part of the discourse, but also in environmental design. It was a time of radical interest in owner building, natural materials, passive solar design, intentional communities. All of these ideas were part of the discourse, and environmental design gathered all the radicals and dissidents from all the architecture schools all over Australia who came to this inspired leadership by Barry McNeill, architect who set up that course. And there's been very little recognition of how influential that course was, but McNeill said in retrospect that 10 years the course lasted, that actually permaculture was probably the most influential thing that came out of it.
So it was kind of like a bit of a think tank.
Yeah, well, for an example, we had lots of visiting lecturers who were paid outside professionals, and George McRoby was there for 3 months. He was actually a colleague of E.F. Schumacher in the intermediate technology group that was doing all this, rather than big complex Western technology, how do you do something that's appropriate to the scale and communities in the third world? Well, he was there in Little Hobart for 3 months lecturing, so it only lasted 10 years, 1969 to 1980, and then it was emasculated and turned back into conventional course. It wasn't just the subject material, there was no fixed curriculum. There was student participation in choosing staff. There was the department functioned as a consultant to government. Postgraduate students worked with undergraduate students. There was self-assessment up to the point of submission of a thesis. So it wasn't just radical in the content, it was radical in the pedagogy, the educational methods. And, you know, I'm pretty scathing about university education, but I acknowledge that seed. And of course Mollison was not involved in that. He was a senior tutor in the psychology faculty, actually at a different institution.
Which, of course, leads to the question then, how did the two of you meet?
Well, I was, even within environmental design, I tended to sort of stay at home a lot and work in the backyard garden that I was documenting as part of my studies. And I went to this workshop that was about how land tenure systems, how land is owned, can determine urban structure. I thought, maybe go along. Anyway, there was this guy there and he was talking about how rabbit trappers could have controlled rabbits in Tasmania and Southern Australia, but they didn't have any incentive to do so because they didn't have any land use rights, so they were actually farming the rabbits on the grazier's land. And no one particularly saw the relevance, and they went back to discussing urban planning regulations and whatever. Anyway, I went up to this guy afterwards, and a lot of the senior students and the staff seemed to know who he was, and I didn't know who he was. He's more of a seaman sort of worker, sort of big meaty hands. And I got talking to him and I thought, God, this guy thinks ecologically, and so different to all the academically trained ecologists I've met. And anyway, I had my arm in a sling because I'd had a motorbike accident. And I was actually looking for somewhere else to live. And he said, you can come and stay at our place if you like. So that's how we met. I didn't know who he was, and then, I was sort of pretty new to Hobart, and people said to me later, "You're living at Bill Mollison's place. What's he like to live with?" But I was young and self-effacing, and I was just like learning so much that his personal sort of personality faults, I might say, or his great ego, and also I met through him this whole network of people who they just did stuff themselves, which to me was incredibly empowering, because although I came from a family of political radicals, when something went wrong with the plumbing, my parents rang up a plumber. Whereas these people around Bill, they were building ocean-going boats in the paddock, and for me that was, yes, this is. And if they didn't know how to do something, they knew someone else who that self-reliant culture that was still strong as a sort of a bohemian network among the fishermen and boat builders and those sort of people. That Bill was all part of that circle, because he, of course, was that before he went to university.
What a rich place for you to land in and grow in. We spoke briefly before this about this idea people sometimes throw around of you and Bill being the fathers of permaculture, and we spoke about, well, who then are the mothers? Do you want to speak a little bit more on that, or even, rather than that, trying to hem you into an answer, even speak about some of the women of the permaculture movement?
Well, firstly, permaculture is spread all over the world, and I suppose there were two people who came to one of the first courses, Declan and Margaret Kennedy, two architects, her German, him Irish, both from working together in Berlin. Declan became the person who taught the first permaculture courses in about 6 different European countries. Margaret Kennedy became famous over her work in alternative currencies. The role they had in the European context, and I would include Declan in that as a very gentle person, a facilitator, a networker, the opposite of Mollison's warrior, attack the world, very perhaps masculine character. Some people have said I was the mother in a sort of way of being. I saw Mollison and his powerful lieutenants going out and hacking pathways through the psychosocial jungle of society, and I walked along those pathways and marvelled at, the territory they had uncovered, but also finding the skeletons in the cupboard, the collateral damage, knitting back together, the undone dishes, the left behind half-finished results. And that part of my role in those early days, I suppose, was also making connections and mending some of those things. But maybe in later years, now at 70, maybe I've turned into a version of a cranky ecological pioneer, more like Bill Mollison was. But other people in Australia who I'd reference, Rosemary Morrow, who's done work all over the world, and we, of course, are the publishers of her big expanded book, Earth Restorer's Guide to Permaculture. Apart from being a woman, her work in teaching and facilitation and respectful connection to many different sources is, and I'd point to two permaculture elders over there, local, Linda Woodrow, who's one of the, and of course my own partner in Life and Love, Sue Dennett, who's in a lot of ways is the thinking behind at least the whole third part in Retro Suburbia, the behavioural section. And a lot of my writing is really channeling her influence.
I guess probably something that maybe is alive for a lot of people here are the issues we're facing as communities with climate change. Is permaculture still relevant today?
I would claim, and I think the Mollison aphorism, the problem is the solution, which we most obviously think of in terms of a problematic weed or pest that we don't like, is actually a challenge to us to actually change our thinking, maybe see the positives in it, or maybe take advantage of it, or learn from the experience. That has been very powerful, focusing on opportunities that come from crises, from things that are happening, but also to avoid what we see repeatedly in society, where the solutions get turned back into the same type of problem. So now I've gone from over the decades as, an incredible supporter of renewable energy. We were supporters and funders, investors in the first community-owned wind farm in Australia, to pointing out some of the problems with the renewable energy industry and the way it's rolled out, which in some ways is part of this large top-down capitalism and often policy-driven thing. So from a permaculture point of view, we see the system's truth that a complex system that works evolves from a simple system that works. And when we try and deal with things at the global scale, it's a bit inevitable that you end up with what's happened in software development. They found that all those big juggernauts, no matter how many resources you throw at it, they don't actually work. You have this minimum viable product, you get something that's working. So that's why the permaculture focus on the individual, the household, the small business, the community scale, get that working, and then recognise that solutions can spread by viral replication, but they also act as an informer. Okay, how do we then apply that at a larger scale? But if you haven't actually ever done it at the small scale and you try and do it at the big scale, I think that's, very true. Now, you could say, well, all these decades of permaculture haven't managed to make much of a dent in those problems either. So I'm not saying that that's easy. I would use an example of one of the type 1 errors that our civilization made, mixing fresh water and shit. And it is a type 1 error because eventually you run out of phosphorus. Phosphorus is the fundamental limit to terrestrial ecology. There is no substitute for it. It all ends up in the sea. And when you have mass sewerage, you get not just industrial contamination, but the shit acts as a super flocculator for heavy metals. You have to then put that back on the land to maintain agriculture over hundreds and thousands of years, and then you end up building up heavy metal toxicities. So dry composting toilets, moving away from centralised liquid sewerage is essential, but the lock-in is enormous. And the stepping stone towards that is the cultural change that has happened through ideas like permaculture, of more people having experience with composting and more people having experience with shitting in a bucket. And it's now everywhere, some of it second and third generation, in various forms. Now, if you said, oh, we need to roll this out on a large scale, yes, the shit would hit the fan, so to speak. You've got to model things and have the mistakes at that small scale, and then the things that work can spread remarkably fast when the psychosocial and socioeconomic environment changes. I'm getting into a huge dissertation there. I should shut up.
So does David ever face despair or overwhelm at what's before us? And if so, what does David do? And what might his advice be to others?
In terms of despair about nature and what its state is, I largely don't experience that because I find a balance with my work, my connection to looking at how nature's regenerative capacity when given half a chance, and especially through the concept of novel ecosystems, how damaged land, like where we live in central Victoria from the gold era, how combinations of native and exotic species are rebuilding soil, creating new biodiversity. So all of the story of the environmental story of death and destruction of nature. This nature is this fragile maiden who's been raped, and can we save her too? No, nature is also this all-powerful Earth Mother who we need to get our house in order, but she's in control. And that is encouraging. It's a balance to that other story. And I'm not saying that other story is completely invalid, but for me that very much balances that despair. And the other one, I think, is just being exposed to the vagaries of nature, being a gardener and a farmer and a forester, and having, the cockatoos eat all your food supply, and it's really serious because you don't go to the supermarket to get what all of those things, the ups and downs of what farmers and fishers and other people who are exposed to nature take for granted. I think in the modern world there's a lot of despair and fear that's about sensitivity, even like to temperature and ordinary weather, and so there's this fragility that nature is sort of somehow this threat to us that our forebears would take for granted. So that's a bit the theme of my latest series of essays, which is Permaculture, Weathering 50 Years of Climate Change, and a life lived in the weather, deliberately in nature. And, you know, coming up the coast here, when we're not staying with wonderful people like Linda and our colleagues at Millpost Permaculture Farm outside Canberra, we've been camping in the bush, you know, lighting a fire on the ground and sitting in the dirt.
Back to basics.
Yeah.
So you went through the Castlemaine Rites of Passage program with your son Oliver. So we'd love to hear some of your reflections about your experience specifically, and maybe some more general thoughts about the relevance of rites of passage in modern day settings.
Well, that was a very special experience in the natural environment, facilitated by very capable male leaders in a process that was focused originally around boys and their fathers making a transition to manhood. But the particular one that Oliver and I joined, him in his mid-30s and me as more approaching the age of a grandfather, was part of an all-adults one that had been the first of these run, and we had the privilege of being the only actual father and son. There were men from 23 to 70 on that, and I think the experience was transformative for all of them. But there was another level of us being father and son that had some of the elements of what happened with boys, but the facilitators said there was a deeper thing because of that we could go with greater depth into that, which was supported, but elements of traditional rites of passage, initiation, challenge that I found really amazing. For example, fire has been a central part of my work. Fire in the landscape, fire in the hearth, wood energy and the importance of our relationship to fire. But in that rites of passage, which involved a lot of use of fire symbolically, it was that fire in the heart that, you know, I'm not that sort of person. I'm a bit of a extreme rationalist, you know, not into all that, as Bill Mollison would say, that woo-woo stuff. That was really important, of acknowledging that as a driver. Oliver has maintained connection to many of the men that went through that with him, and they have had a men's gathering circle, and he's also been a provider of food and catering, including hunted kangaroo to those events, because it's completely a voluntary thing that's been running in central Victoria for a long time. So I think these rites of passage obviously happen spontaneously in the absence of society having them anymore. And I would acknowledge for myself the journey with hallucinogenics as a teenager was very important in breaking down that super rationalist mind that I had to understand there were far more things in human consciousness than we can ever understand through that. But those were unassisted processes, and I think we need that for both boys and girls. And in Central Victoria there's a women's rites of passage which is building in parallel. So I think those processes are very important, and they link to a lot of Indigenous and traditional cultures of place processes that were universal everywhere.
Yeah, acknowledging life stages and deepening them. Yeah. So you're in your 70s now. Is there any advice that you'd actually give your younger self?
I don't really have any regrets or mistaken pathways. One of the most obvious ones was with the huge interest there was in permaculture in the beginning, and I walked away from that to focus on building my own skills and let Mollison take permaculture to the world. Because in 1978, I could see what was happening. This was going to be rock star treatment, and I was 23 years old. And I had the wisdom to say no to that at that age. And yes, that could have been a pathway to, influencing the UN in the development of sustainable development goals and all of that sort of upper level thing, because I would have been starting that journey a generation younger than Mollison, and maybe because I was a little bit more diplomatic and not abusing people like he had a tendency to do, shooting himself in the foot. I could have had that pathway up into all of that sort of big circle of influence. And my advice as a 70-year-old is, don't take it. And I didn't.
What gifts has saying no to that offered your life?
Well, firstly, the creating the world by just going out and doing it. That freedom to say, I'm just going to live this way, not sort of fighting against systems or trying to persuade others to use their much greater power to influence other things, but to actually be the guinea pig of your own experiments. Of your own ideas. And that has given me, I believe, a healthy life where there's been a diversity of physical and mental activity. Maybe I've also been lucky to navigate and not have serious adverse accidents that might have undermined that. And it also gave me a grounded truth as I then started to come out and be recognised as a conceptualiser rather than just a practical doer, that yes, this actually comes from at least my own lived experience. But the other side is you end up, as said, the cranky ecological pioneer said, why didn't they realise this, or why didn't they do that?
I told you so.
Yeah, which never is useful.
So perhaps following on from that, your book Retro Suburbia is considered a bestseller by Australian standards, even though it has never received a single review in mainstream media. Could you talk a little bit about that? There's this thing, the intellectual gatekeepers still operate. The people who do the reviews in the big important newspapers and the ABC and whatever. And there's this funny thing that certainly self-published books are just put aside. There's a huge number of books, and there tends to be that thing that, there's this book for this market, whatever, and that's all created by the industry, the publishing industry, which says, you put that together with that. And, us as self-publishers, we just break all those rules.
So the same thing happened with Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, even though it's translated into 8 languages and sold more than most books of complex ideas in Australia, which only really have a market for about 10,000 copies. So Retro Suburbia, maybe there's also an underlying systemic intelligence that recognises that this is economic treason. Even though it's just like friendly stuff that people can do, but if people applied it, it would actually result in a major contraction in GDP. So I don't know whether somehow there's a zeitgeist of, that I'm not talking about a conspiracy, but I'll just give a little example. When I was doing all these presentations using my Aussie Street story to enliven the Retro Suburbia strategy before the book came out, in the decade before it was published in 2018, I used to end the Aussie Street story with this sort of list of things people could do that were part of really fundamentally contributing to the larger issues in the environment and society and good for them. And one was, as homeowners, take in a boarder. Take someone into your house and share your house. And, of course, we've got these millions of empty beds, let alone, empty houses. We don't have a shortage of buildings in Australia. So I don't know whether there's an element of that or whether it's just also that from a publishing point of view, Retro Suburbia is actually 3 books. That's the built environment, all the buildings and water systems and waste and stuff like that, and the biological, or the gardening and animal husbandry, and then there's the behavioural. And, some people in the publishing industry said, we would publish that as 3 books. You bring them out in succession and you make more money that way, and rather than having this whopping great big life manual. But it's a curious thing, given it's on its 3rd print run.
Something like that.
Yeah, so that's nearly 15,000 copies or so.
Yeah, it's a great book and so relevant to so many of us who live in suburban settings. Turning to your other book, Future Scenarios, which you wrote in 2009, or which was published in 2009, what do you think about your forecasts now for the future with 16 years of hindsight?
Yeah, well, I suppose I was jumping the gun, you would say, on both peak oil and climate change. Now, most people would say, peak oil didn't really sort of happen, but climate change has. Well, actually, I sort of put it the other way around. I think climate change hasn't happened as fast as I was expecting, and neither has peak oil. But I think a lot of the changes in the world that are happening at the moment are actually a direct result of peak oil, the geopolitical things. I think they're actually impacting incredibly, but they're never spoken about, and society's inoculated against them. I suppose there's elements, especially of my brown tech scenario, which I, in 2013, said, looks like we're heading into my brown tech scenario, that I think have emerged, but in ways that are, of course, completely different to what I expected. And so I think there's still value in that, but of course, as all futurists know, you're condemned to be wrong no matter what you do or say. And I was commenting to Sue on the way up here on the motorway with all the massive traffic of stuff going backwards and forwards. And I thought, 20 years ago, I would have thought that by now all of that further motorway infrastructure building would have stopped, and possibly the potholes would not be being repaired, and amazingly it still is, even if around the fringes, out in the hinterland, the impacts of both nature and geopolitically in the world as we know it is unravelling daily. And I think that discourse is to some extent lost, and in other places just shows up in the usual ways of, oh, it's bad actors and bad behaviours of, I don't know, Russia or, some other group that, whereas the deeper understandings of the energy and environment drivers in creating the future, I think, reflect that work a lot.
You tend to look at problems as opportunities, as a given. So what are some of the biggest opportunities we have over the coming decades?
Oh, well, we have a renewable energy industry that seems to put solar panels on roofs and then rip them off a few years later and throw them away when they're perfectly good. So these things that we used to regard as incredibly precious, there's this huge opportunity for people who have the skills and the knowledge to work outside the legal framework and actually just harvest all of that stuff, often from solar installers for no cost. And electric cars that are not repaired, that, there's these huge opportunities of creative reuse that we never imagined 25 years ago, certainly 50 years ago, because we thought when the resource limits of society really bite, things like polypipe and stainless steel will be really hard to get. Society has created so much stuff where actually we have a shortage of skills and the opportunities to actually make use of all the things as the consumption economy drives itself through towards the cliff. It's shedding all of these things which are opportunities for creative reuse. And I think it's also out in nature. Yes, progressively industrial forestry is coming to the end of a long cycle, but our forests are these powerful organisms which are capturing carbon at 20 tonnes per hectare per annum in some places, in amazing structural woods and all of this energy in the landscape. You can't stop nature producing. We also have so much meat in this country. Like, Australia does not spontaneously produce plant foods that we can just eat, but most places in rural Australia, you can't stop it producing animals, whether they're rabbits, wood ducks, kangaroos, deer, cockatoos. So there's all of these abundances both in nature and in the industrial shedding, that where are the creative skills working at the fringes to make use of those incredible opportunities?
What would your advice be then for someone, say a suburban Coffs Harbour person wanting to take you up on some of these ideas? How do they become a creative person at the fringe, or how do they start with permaculture in a meaningful way, not just a kind of token add-on way?
Well, I think some of those opportunities are most relevant to young people looking at where are they going to go, where are they going to learn and develop skills that are on the move. And we map this in retro-suburbia as the mobile minimalists. The classic retro-suburbanites are often people with kids or about to have kids, are sort of getting grounded to place and are looking at often much more modest objectives of putting in place the connections, the opportunities in existing, often run-down houses that are sometimes worth less than the vacant land value, opportunities to share with others to avoid the massive mortgage debt, and can get connected in walkable neighbourhood to help exchange and create what Sue calls a new normal for kids that only requires another couple of families to, just with young children, create a complete new normal of this is the way we do things. So having some support in that way, and starting with whatever the passion is to greater self-reliance. And for a lot of people it is growing food, and there can't be still anything more important than that. And especially with raising young children, to exposing them to being able to go out and forage. And I think one of those opportunities also in suburbia is understanding where the wild foraging, whether it's in the vast suburban landscapes, but often in the wild hinterlands, whether it's collecting mushrooms or fishing or doing all sorts of things that add to the limited home patch and complement the limited home patch.
Yeah, that deep connection to place.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not just this is this piece of land that we have title to. It's actually this whole landscape, and how is the respectful use of the commons. Because there's commons everywhere that the authorities don't really have the resources to manage, and it's navigating the social license to actually make use of those places and make it more amenable, fire safe, whatever, in ways often outside the regulatory system. We see a lot of efforts in community gardens, and I think those are important and supporting those things, but there's also in some cases there's this overburden of regulation and turgid, slow moving, and sometimes it takes that feral action at the fringes to provide the precedent that then something can be accepted as a good thing.
You know, I've sort of sat with this what is permaculture for some time now, and what I keep coming back to is permaculture really is a way of thinking and being in the world rather than a specific action. Would you agree with that?
Yes, and that's why we say the principles and ethics of permaculture are universal, they apply everywhere, but the strategies and techniques are unique to context of people and place. And they shift, and there's no one way that, this applies everywhere. Not at that level of a specific technical solution. And of course I've been on the record over the decades of all the permaculture sacred cows, whether it's a herb spiral or a swale or whatever else, the essential permaculture plant, Fajoa. No. Yes, they might be in some contexts, but not in others.
Yeah.
Depends, does it?
It depends. Yeah, this is the joke about in a permaculture design course. The answer to every question is it depends.
To finish up the formal side of our conversation this afternoon, David, is there anything that has completely floored you, completely surprised you over the years about the uptake of permaculture, both nationally and or internationally?
I think a lot of things. One recently that I was surprised at is permaculture has had a bit of a thread over some years and decades in Taiwan, and Principles and Pathways was translated into Chinese in Taiwan, and I thought, with rising tension between China and Taiwan, I could see from my geopolitical perspective how permaculture was potentially almost part of the Western soft power, not really direct up with big important stuff, but of influencing other nations. And I thought, that'll probably mean it's a dead in the water in mainland China because it's seen as, oh, it's those people over there and it's a thing from America and Australia. And it's interesting that there's a whole beginnings of a back to the land movement in mainland China, and it's not around all adopting completely Western ideas. Some of it is about regaining traditional Confucian and Taoist values that are also not seen particularly by the Communist Party as subversive anymore. As part of this adoption of this is the Chinese way. And so I've been really amazed that there's been this little growth, and Rosemary Morrow's book is being translated into Chinese in mainland China. So little things like that have surprised me. I suppose the development earlier on of the role of permaculture in Cuba when Cuba was hit by the crisis in 91, when the Soviet Union collapsed and its economy under sanctions from the United States went into a crisis of energy, food shortage, whatever. And there were permaculture activists there at the right time in the right place, and permaculture had this little contribution that was just that thing of timing. Yeah. And I think that sometimes it's a matter of being in the right place at the right time.
And we can't forecast how the miracle of nature and emergent ideas work.
Yeah.
Thank you, David. If you'd all like to join me in thanking We do have time for just a quick couple of questions before we actually move into a World Cafe session where you'll be expected to participate and contribute ideas if you're willing. David will then hear some of those ideas and give us some closing comments or suggestions. So does anyone have any questions that they feel we haven't covered in our conversation this afternoon?
Oh dear.
Thank you for that talk, David. That was enlightening. Oh, it's not on. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
That was so enlightening. I would like you to talk about. I'd like you to talk more about nature and some of the ideas that have evolved since your early days. For instance, we all now know a lot more about things like mycelium. The ideas of Gaia have perhaps changed and grown and taken on more credence. What are your own personal higher beliefs?
Whoa, well, I suppose I've moved from that hard rationalist scientific view of the world more towards an animist view that viewing the earth as alive and all things having some form of consciousness, whether it's real in some way that might be validated scientifically, it makes sense to think of those things that way. Certainly the Gaia hypothesis, the idea that the earth is a self-organising entity that maintains its own homeostasis against things that are a mortal threat to it, as opposed to things that might be a mortal threat to some of the participating species. I think that's so evidently true by what we know from deep paleoecology and but also from all the wisdom traditions. So I don't have a sort of particular spiritual framework or belief in that sense, but I see a greater coming together of holistic understandings of science and spiritual notions of that. And I see a lot of respect for other ways of thinking about the world, including our own more land-based ancestors. So I don't know whether that was sort of the direction or nature of your question. I still push back about, take the idea of forests and all the trees are in symbiosis and feeding each other. Yes, I think there is a lot of evidence of that, but the reality of competition between like entities, of whether it's tree seedlings in the forest or carrots in the garden, is real. Competition is a real part of nature, but I think recognising the symbiotic interconnections and mutual supports that we keep finding more and more. So when I was young, the idea of symbiotic bacteria feeding nitrogen to plants was seen as a weird, like, special case. Of course, now we know there's all these interfaces of microbial life that's doing these exchange functions. And so those mutual support processes, which I think just brings us back to that greater mystery, that soil is still the biggest mystery that we don't fully understand. It's still the most important thing for us to work on, and we accept the mystery of things, that we don't understand everything. And we actually, what we understand, as Stuart Hill said, is actually this small speck, and then there's all this sort of unknown stuff.
Excuse my ignorance if this is like common knowledge, but how much has Indigenous ecological knowledge informed permaculture or been incorporated into it? And is that somewhere we could go further in tying in with the Australian context?
Yeah, well, basically both. When I met Mollison, we were discussing the recently coined term fire stick farming that the ecologist and anthropologist Rhys Jones coined in 1972, 2 years before I met Bill, and all of those ideas of that the landscape in Australia was actually a cultivated landscape, as is now accepted due to the work of, amongst others, Bill Gamage and Bruce Pascoe. So those ideas were definitely part of that. And Mollison himself personally was connected very strongly to all the families of the Cape Barren Islanders who, as a result of his academic work, who traced all their lineages in the years just before I met Bill. That led to the Australian government recognising those people as actually being Tasmanian Aborigines, which previously had been denied that they even existed. So there was that personal connection, him as a seaman knowing all those people, but there was also the influences from literature of Indigenous and traditional cultures of place that informed permaculture. And more generally, this idea that the assumptions and arrogance of modernity powered by fossil fuels, if that is not a sustainable thing, then if not copying traditional things exactly, we needed to learn from why did all of our forebears in different places. Obviously the forest gardening of tropical cultures in New Guinea, other places, they're all influences. And I think because the sort of knowledge and understanding of that is grown, books like Victor Stephenson's Fire Country, which Sue's got on there, I mean, that is incredible rediscovery of this knowledge that was sort of been squashed or repressed or hidden or packed away because it was vulnerable, that those things are bubbling up again. But I also think there's a huge expectation in white middle class Australia that having sort of stuffed everything up, will Indigenous mob actually save us and fix things, and loading on to people who have actually come through this massive struggle and been the battlers at the bottom of society. Suddenly this expectation that, oh, where's all this knowledge? So it's a process of mutual rediscovery and becoming rooted to a place which is now new and different, not just because of the effects of modernity, but because of newcomer species that are creating novel ecosystems that will require us to develop novel cultures. So, for example, where we live in central Victoria, I see the Indigenous culture, the Western European cool, temperate culture of my Celtic ancestors, and the Mediterranean culture are three powerful legs of a new cultural stool. Whereas up here, it's a completely different mix. And in Darwin, it's completely different. You know, the only common one in all of those is the local Indigenous mob culture, which themselves, of course, are quite different in those places. But I think there's also, in my work, I've often referred to these, that all cultures of place, in spite of their difference, have more in common than any of them do with modernity. Modernity is the weird thing. It's the weird thing. So when we arrived in Hepburn, for example, this elderly woman came up onto our building site in one of her walks around and said, "And where do your people come from?" Which is not so different to Aboriginal people meeting and going, "Where's your mob? Where are you from?" Whereas in the modern world, we say, you know, "I'm Dave, you're Sue." Disconnected from place, disconnected from context, lineage. So rediscovering some of those things, of course, there's deep, particular knowledge, wisdom in Indigenous culture, but a lot of the things are just rediscovering all of the ordinary things of our own ancestors. And Robin Francis told me in her dealing with Bunjalung elders decades ago, they said to her, "What's your dreaming? Where do you come from?" Rediscover that lineage, and that took her on her discovery of herbal medicine and in her own journey. So I think there's a sort of a continuing and important relationship there. But yeah, there were certainly elements of that from the beginnings of permaculture.
Both great questions, thank you. Yeah.
Do we have time for two more?
Yeah.
Okay, there was one down here before that put their hand up, and then I've got one back here.
Okay.
Hi David, I'd just like to say thank you firstly for all your work, ongoing work to helping humankind. It's very appreciated by me and I take a lot of influence from your work. So my question is, for the young people and the old people that are transitioning back to living at their home with their parents, how would you go navigating the waters to returning to the home?
Yes, this intergenerational, how we tolerate difference and the differences that we don't like and the old patterns of how do we break out of that. I think firstly there's, maybe now that I'm 70, this is sort of a bit self-serving, but there's a responsibility for younger people in those relationships to not so much expect their aging parents to change as much as they can. But there's also the need for older people not to hang on and be feel like they need to be in control, because progressively we lose control anyway. And we are beholden and dependent on younger people, whether they are family or others or institutional systems. So I think recognising that is difficult. We've just been at the Millpost fine wool merino sheep organic permaculture farm, where there are 3 generations of family sharing that, and that seems to be a rare occurrence. There's a tendency in permaculture and kindred networks for people to have been cranky individualists, and then sometimes their kids want to do the exact opposite. There's also those processes of those who have been the cranky individualists having to accept the parents they rejected in youth, that now they need that more mature relationship of an acceptance, and the things they can still learn, or the way we find ourselves as we get older actually showing, for better and worse, some of the habits and characteristics of our of our parents. So I think it's a huge area of difficulty, but it has enormous potential of building stronger, resilient households. And of course, just the economic forces of our time are actually forcing it. So if we can do it in a way that is less driven by gritted teeth and circumstance to what are the learning opportunities from that, I think it's a big one.
Yeah.
Thanks. I didn't provide you with a recipe, did I?
It depends.